Welcome to the Casting Across Fly Fishing Podcast. I'm Matthew of castingacross.com, where I explore the quarry and culture of fly fishing. Today, on the 314th episode of the podcast, we are diving into a very specific aspect of fly fishing, and that is your wrist. Your wrist. And here's the big deal. This is why it matters so much. We're going to start with talking about casting, and then we're going to move into presenting the fly and fighting fish, and wrist position matters so much. And to dive right into it, in talking about the fly cast, think about the amount of variables that go into a fly cast. So starting at the very end, your fly matters. Whether it be a large weighted streamer or a small, delicate dry fly, the weight and the wind resistance of that fly is going to have an impact on your cast. Then move to the tippet. Primarily the length, but also the diameter of it is going to have an impact on it. Then the type of fly line that you have, both the construction and the weight of it, and how that has an interplay with the leader and with the fly rod. Then the fly rod, its make, its length, its construction, its taper, its material. Every one of those aspects is going to impact your fly cast. And then we move down to the hand and the wrist, which we'll talk about more today, but that is ultimately the link between the equipment and you. Your forearm, your elbow, your bicep, your shoulder, and your torso, your waist, and your feet all impact your fly cast. Now, a good fly caster, somebody who understands the dynamics of a fly cast, is able to have one or two or three of those facets of the fly cast be less than perfect and still present the fly. And this is really what happens when you're having to cast from an awkward position, or you're maybe using a fly that is a little bit different from what should be within that normal range of fly selection for the gear that you're using. But really, it's very, very important that you become comfortable with and familiar with all of the important and essential aspects of the fly cast as they should be. And then from there, you can build and learn more techniques, become more familiar with the gear, with yourself, your position, your motion, such that you're able to make casts if some of those things aren't able to come together. So again, I use the example of the wrong fly. The same thing could do with your footing. If you cannot face with your hips the area that you want to cast towards, then you're going to have some compromises in your casting stroke. But you're able to overcome those based upon how you use your shoulder, your wrist, your arm, your elbows, and everything in between. Okay, and so all of that to say, the wrist is that fulcrum point, not literally in the sense of a fly cast, but between you and your gear. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. And here's the reason why. I have found in teaching fly casting, and then when I'm casting myself, and I realize that there's something that's happening that maybe is a little out of whack, it is oftentimes my wrist that is the culprit. Now, why is that? At a very basic level, your wrist is the weakest aspect of the entire equation that you can control. Your range of motion with your wrist is greater than your range of motion with your elbow, and it is with your shoulder. Certainly the same thing is true for your hips as well. And so the wrist is usually the first thing to go when you are tired, when you are taxed, or if you are developing your skill as a fly caster. And so today, like I said, we're going to talk about the wrist as it relates to casting, presenting, and fighting fish. Now, this, again, might sound like minutia, but let me tell you, this is, by and large, one of the first things that I have to address with people when they ask for my opinion on a fly cast or when I'm teaching fly casting in a more formal setting. It is wrist control. And there's some kind of quick and easy things that we can look at, and we'll talk about those. And there's actually some quick and easy solutions for them. But the first thing I want to talk about is moving side to side. Moving side to side. So as you make your cast, you want to keep as many things on the same plane as possible. So that is to say, if you are trying to get your energy from your back cast to your forward cast, the most amount of energy is going to be retained in your casting stroke, both forward and backwards, if that rod is moving along the same plane. And not only is that rod moving along the same plane where your hand is, but then of course that 7 to 9 feet telegraphed all the way up to the rod tip ought to be as close in the same plane as possible. Now, this isn't something that needs to be done with a level of obsession that's going to drive you crazy and make fly casting not fun. But essentially, what we're talking about is limiting the amount of side-to-side variability that you get in your fly rod. So it's going to be moving backwards and then forwards and backwards again in your casting stroke. That's just how a fly cast works. But as it starts to go to the side, kind of cocked to usually away from you, so if you're right-handed caster, off to the right, now your rod tip is moving in an arc, and your fly line is not moving necessarily in an arc, it's moving kind of in a figure eight, and which is it's already doing that forward and backwards, but now you're introduced some angle away from your body. So now you have a forward to back figure eight as well as a figure eight or even an arc that's going side to side. So all that energy that is being manipulated forward and backwards is getting diminished because there's also energy moving side to side. So one of your elbow is a big part of this, but the wrist is also a big part of this as well. When you are casting and your wrist starts to get lazy and cock outwards because of the weight of the rod or the weight of the line, the perceived weight of the line, then this is a quick way that you can lose that line speed. Now, I would say, generally speaking, the elbow is the greatest component. That is the biggest offender in this dynamic of your rod dropping to the side. But your wrist can do this also, especially when you're casting heavier rods with heavier lines. If you add a sinking line to your 6 weight, or if you're casting the 8 or 10 weight, then the weight of that rod and all the weight that you're casting, it has a tendency to pull your wrist outwards. Because even if you think about it, we can gain more momentum if we go to the side. The problem is, although that's true, the problem is now you're introducing that side kind of parallel movement with your fly rod butt, which again telegraphs up to that rod tip, and you lose line speed. So as much as is possible, if you keep that wrist in line, you think about if you have your thumb pointing straight up, you want your thumb to go straight up, straight in front of you, and then your back cast straight up and then straight behind you. Again, minute variations are natural and normal and sometimes can be helpful for maintaining a good cast. But we're not talking about that thumb moving away from you, kind of so it looks like you're hitchhiking if you're right-handed to your right. That's not what we want. That's where you start to lose line speed. So that's the first part of the cast, where I think that a lot of folks, especially as you move into heavier line weights, or when you start to bomb out long casts, even if you're using like a 3 or a 4 or a 5 weight, when you start to cast out to 60, 70, 80 feet, if I don't know how often you do that with a 3 weight, but when you start to do that, that's when you start to move out to the side because it's the perceived easier casting motion. But you start to lose a lot of your line speed because your tip starts to move in a greater arc. The next thing is breaking your wrist. This is something that happens a lot, particularly with new casters. We watch someone fly fish and we think all you do is whip this thing backwards and forwards. And what ends up happening then is that arc ends up going all the way behind us to kind of a negative angle down by the water behind us, and then all the way in front of us to a positive angle to the water in front of us. The 10 and 2 thing is a little bit rigid, but I'd rather someone be 10 and 2 than 3 and 9. So again, if you look at yourself casting and that 9 o'clock position is directly behind you, the 3 o'clock position is directly in front of you, 12 is above you, 6 is below you, that 10 and 2 position is again that stereotypical fly cast where you're keeping that rod tip up nice and high. And the best way to achieve that is to keep your wrist relatively static. It is a very, very gentle motion of your wrist forward and backwards. Now, this said, that the nuance comes in by applying that little bit of pop and application of energy, which comes somewhat with your wrist, but also a lot with your thumb. Your thumb has a much greater role in this process than we like to give it credit for. Making that cast forward and that cast backwards, that thumb allows for that pop of energy as that line extends out. And so really, I think what is happening when people break their wrists is one of two things. One, they're an inexperienced fly caster and they're just kind of trying to replicate what they see happen. And secondly, it is a little bit of an overreaction to that appropriate response to feeling that line go out and load. So as you're feeling that line go out and the weight of that line and the energy transfer going either behind you or in front of you, you're feeling the weight of that line, and you know that this is when you're supposed to now start to alter the momentum of that cast and either bring it forward if you're going backwards or backward if you're going forwards. And it's an overreaction to that, and the wrist breaks either backwards too much or forward too much. And so the solution to this is relatively simple. It is to lock that wrist down. Now, again, not to be rigid, but to keep it with a relatively static place against your forearm so that you are not overreacting and snapping that wrist too forward, backwards, or too far forward. Now, I believe Joan Wolfe, well, she's popularized it. I'm sure other people have used it. A little device that is effectively a wrist brace. Now, I've done this before with people where I've used a bandana and I've kind of wrapped it between their forefinger and their thumb, and it effectively limits their range of motion, and it forces them to get locked into using just a smaller motion forward and backwards when that line is extended, and using their thumb and a little bit of a snap to get that line to go out and allow it to go back again. Now, again, what this does is it allows that rod to do what it was made to do. As soon as that rod drops to a really low angle, it doesn't have enough power to recover and get that line up or back. So really, once your rod drops down to that 3 o'clock position or to that 9 o'clock position, it's not going to have enough strength to now pull back into a back cast or drop or shoot that line forward into a forward cast. And so when your wrist pushes that rod back or it drops that rod forward too much, you lose all of your power. So that's a quick and easy fix. If you are finding that you are getting big loops in the back and that's not super helpful, and then they end up collapsing or they end up looping over themselves, then that's something to consider. It might not be as extreme as your rod tip hitting the water behind you, but if it's dropping a little too much, then it might be helpful to throw a strap around your wrist, throw a handkerchief around your wrist, and limit how much your rod can move your wrist. And so you can learn and get that muscle memory of what it entails to only have a little bit of wrist motion. And again, to keep everything else similar and consistent, moving that elbow on a forward and backward plane, moving that shoulder in a forward and backward plane. But again, today we're talking more about the wrist. Now, again, if some of this sounds abstract, and again, this is on a podcast, this is best done visually and even better done hands-on, but go watch a casting video. Go watch somebody on the Orvis Learning Center, or Farbank has an entire series of classes on this, and watch these guys who are doing these things instinctually. You might say, no, they are moving their wrist. Well, there's a big difference between moving your wrist slightly as you are applying power, especially as you are laying down that presentation, than there is from whipping back and forth such that your thumb is pointing at 3 o'clock and then your thumb is pointing at 9 o'clock. There are situations and circumstances where that is the case and that needs to happen, but they are few and far between. Even think about someone bombing on a super far double haul with like a 9-weight on the flats, and more often than not, their thumb is still pointed up at like 2 o'clock and 10 o'clock as they're making those casts up until they make that presentation. All right, so that is how the wrist impacts casting. That's two examples of how the wrist impacts casting. And another thing, too, is it might feel really tense and like you're doing a lot of work when you're starting to do this, but I guarantee you that over the long haul, this is less wear and tear on your wrist. It's going to give you more strength and it's going to make you a better caster over the long haul, especially when you are using heavier rod and line weights. All right, now let's talk about fighting fish and how your wrist helps you in fighting fish. So when you are fighting smaller fish, or even when you're fighting larger fish with a heavier tippet, a lot can happen if you move that rod behind you. So now I'm not talking pivoting around so that your like left shoulder's facing the fish and your right shoulder is facing away from the fish. I'm talking about actually allowing that rod to fight that fish. So again, if you have a new graphite rod, or if you have a bamboo rod, if you have a fiberglass rod in particular, rods that have flex in them, they are built to help you fight the fish. A lot of times, people will fight fish simply by trying to reel it in, and that rod effectively becomes just kind of a suppressor for the tippet. You want that rod to help you pull that fish in. That rod has been built so that it can flex at a significant angle and that you can use it to pull fish in. So this is, if you are environmentally focused and you are conservation minded, then this is an important thing that you want to do. And we all ought to be if we plan on throwing that fish back, or if we want to plan on eating it. Getting it in is the best thing that you can do. And so let's just imagine you've got a 5-weight and you've got a 12-inch trout on. You want that rod to be at a bare minimum straight vertical above you, or maybe even cocked back a little bit behind you. And this is actually the best place to be, because now that fish is not only fighting you pulling it as you are stripping line in, but it's having to fight the flex of that rod. And again, why did you pay $300, $600, $900 for a fly rod? Part of it is to cast, but part of it is to fight fish and to be sensitive to those lightweight tippets. The same thing is true if you're fighting a big, heavy fish. You want that thing to be tired out because it is pulling against kind of a throbbing, energy-reducing piece of graphite or fiberglass. So having it as a little bit of a negative angle behind you can really help. Now, you have to be quick. If that fish makes a run, if it jumps, you got to move. But that's part and parcel of fighting a fish anyway. But one of the areas where I really learned that this is a beneficial way of fighting fish after years of just kind of doing it instinctively, but also probably doing it the wrong way a number of times, is when I've fished with tenkara rods. You cannot fight a decent sized fish, even like a 10-inch bluegill, on a 12-foot tenkara rod and have that thing anything but angled away and behind from you. So it creates this big, long parabolic arch kind of up and away from you and then down over you and then at an angle towards that fish. So that fish is pulling against not just you stripping that line in. Well, with a tenkara rod, there's no line to strip in, but it's having to fight the rod. The same thing is true to a lesser degree, but still significantly, when you are using a traditional fly fishing setup. Now, how do you do this? Well, the first step is to, again, consider your wrist. Is your thumb pointing straight up? Now, again, you're probably not using your thumb pointing on your cork, but if you were to stick your thumb out, would it be pointing straight up? Would it be pointing towards the fish, which oftentimes happens? We like to pull kind of up on the fish. So here's a great example. Think about how you're drifting a nymph, and then you hook a fish. What do you do with that rod? If you go straight up to set the hook, do you hold it there so that that rod is now parallel over the water? This is not the optimum way to fight a fish. It's fighting it at one dimension, but you can have it fight it at two dimensions if you pull it back. And so this is what we're talking about with this rod kind of coming backwards ever so slightly. So if you were to be holding that rod grip, you would want your thumb to be either close to straight up or a little bit behind you. Again, use discernment. If you hook the fish of a lifetime and this thing is going on lots of runs, then obviously you're not going to point the rod at a slight, 10 to 15 degree angle behind you. But incorporating this into fighting more moderate sized fish, especially if you're using a 9-foot rod, is a good way to get them in quicker. You have to take into consideration the water. You have to take into consideration how the fish is fighting. You have to take into consideration your hook set. How did that go? The diameter and the strength of your tippet. All of those things matter. But again, if you're using high quality equipment and you've got a good diameter tippet and the fish is not a monster and it's not doing anything crazy in the way it's fighting, then do cock that rod behind you ever so slightly and make that fish fight your rod as well as you stripping or reeling in line. Practice it on something small. Practice it on some bluegill. Practice on the 12-inch trout, and you'll find that it is a good tool to have in your arsenal. All right, last one is the presentation. So I kind of jumped ahead. I went from casting to fighting fish. But one more I wanted to mention is your presentation. This one is, again, something that comes with experience, and it's also an issue as fatigue sets in. If you're not catching a lot of fish, is your rod in a position to set the hook well on a fish? So is your rod in a position to set the hook well on a fish? Now, as you are following that line and that fly down the creek as you're making your presentation, we might have the tendency to lift that rod as we follow it down. Well, if that rod tip is either too low so you've got your rod tip pointed at the water, or too high, it's if not straight up, it's close to straight up. It's going to take a lot to set that hook unless you have a supreme grip in how you're handling your line in your offhand. It's good to kind of have that rod at that 45 or plus angle. Now, again, I know that can't always be the case when you're Euro nymphing, when you're doing some other kinds of tight line nymphing. But even then, what you have to do, because you're usually at that point, your thumb is almost at a downward angle, even though that rod is parallel with the water. But your hook set has to adjust for that. And so a lot of times it's hook setting downstream and up. And so that takes a lot of elbow as you maintain that position with your wrist. But again, this is just something to consider. A lot of folks, again, when they are beginning, their rod tip is pointing at the water, and then you have to make a big sweeping hook set, which one, sometimes trout take it and spit it out too fast, and you can't do that. And secondly, it's hard to generate enough force to really lodge that hook in if that's the case. So just be cognizant and aware of your wrist. So the two areas for casting, which is keep your wrist on a plane. Don't hitchhike with your thumb as you're casting. Secondly, do not point your thumb at 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock while you're casting. You watch the best fly casters in the world bomb out deep, deep casts, and just pay attention to where their wrist is, even on those really long casts. With the presentation, as I just mentioned a moment ago, just make sure that your rod is in a position so that when you make that cast, you're able to move a large amount of line in a short, quick moment. And again, where goes your wrist, so goes your rod tip. So just be cognizant of that. And then lastly, fighting fish. Use your rod, and it includes tip, midsection, and butt. And your butt section is going to be right where your wrist puts it. So be aware of that. So much more that could be said, but certainly a lot more that could be seen. So as I've already said, I encourage you to go check it out. Go play around with these things. If you're like, this doesn't make any sense, well, do what I explained that's wrong, and then do what I said and see how it's right. So try the bad stuff and the good stuff and see how the differences feel. But again, go watch somebody. Even go say, hey, I was listening to this podcast, and this guy was talking about controlling my wrists both on the horizontal plane and the vertical plane. What does that look like? And have someone show you. And again, a lot of this will give you those incremental benefits as you cast that can help take you to the next level. And if you know how to do this well, if you're now limited in what you can do with your hips or your feet or your shoulder, you can make better casts. Or if you have to break your wrist because of the position, you're crouched down and you can't use your elbow because you're leaning on it, well, then you can use your wrist. It's not dogmatic. And ultimately, at the end of the day, if you're casting and catching fish, awesome. Do what you need to do. But if you want to take your casting to the next level, these are some good tips that are worth considering. This week on castingacross.com, first article is called New Tying Gear from Loon for Beginners and Pros. New tying gear from Loon for beginners and pros. All right, so I like tying with Loon fly tying tools. I like fishing with Loon fly fishing tools. I spotlight 5 new products. One is a tension control bobbin. One is a very precision cutting tool. And then 3 are different types of tweezers. And for someone who's not a great tyer, all of these tools kind of add a handicap into my tying. I can make mistakes, and these tools help me undo them or turn them into something good. Now, in the hands of an expert or a more advanced tyer, I'm sure that you can do all sorts of stuff with these particular tools. And so I would encourage you to check those out and then head over to Loon and look at those. I'll actually give one of my recommendations at the end of this podcast will be one of these tools in particular. And then Wednesday's article was called Kids Agree, All Fish Are Awesome. So Noel Vick put out a book called All Fish Are Awesome, and I got a copy of it, and I read it to my children, and they like it. And why do they like it? Because there's big pictures, and it's good facts. It's not like sunfish are the color of the sun. It talks about how many eggs perch lay, and it talks about how big sturgeon can get. Stuff like that is a lot of fun. They absolutely like it, and I did too. So you can check out a review for All Fish Are Awesome over on castingacross.com. This week's recommendation on the podcast, as promised, is a $12 tool. $12 tool. Now, it's a very simple tool, but for $12, it's worth adding to your arsenal. So this is the Loon Outdoors Ergo Easy Cutter. Comes in yellow, comes in black, whatever makes you happy, you get it. But it's effectively a small notched implement with a razor-honed cutting tool at the end of it. Now, I like this because it allows me to use something like hackle pliers or even delicate forceps or tweezers and grab a material, pull it out, and then without even having to have use scissors, I just kind of touch the end of this Ergo Easy Cutter right to that spot, and it shears off whatever I want to shear off with great precision. I feel like I can even get closer with scissors because you can, the way it's built, you can lay it up against something and slide it. So a good pair of scissors can do this, but I feel like this is quicker and easier, and I feel like you can see it a little bit better. And by having to push to cut as opposed to squeeze, it just gives you another option. So again, $12 for another option, a little bit of flexibility. It's a great little tool. I'll put a link to Loon Outdoors at this podcast show notes over at castingacross.com. Thanks for listening to the Casting Across Fly Fishing Podcast. Please subscribe in your favorite podcast app, rate the podcast in Spotify and iTunes. Then head over to castingacross.com for 3 posts a week on the people, places, and things that go into the pursuit of fish.